probably polite.
Okay. Hi, I'm here with Dr. James Fadiman, a psychologist who has written this book, The Psychedelic Explorer's Guide. And we were talking about experiences with psychedelics and the research that's been done on it. And some point before the last show, he suggested that we retitle it Seeking the Divine Within. And so the conversation morphed to that subject, and we thought we would continue that in more depth. So Dr. Fadiman, welcome to part two.
It's very nice to be here again.
Yeah. Now, how are we going to begin this? I remember about 2 years ago, I went up to see Houston Smith, the great religious scholar. And at one point we were talking about the near-death experience, because he's really fascinated by this. And I said, Dr. Smith, if the brain is flatlined during a near-death experience, and people can be conscious of their surroundings and what's going on way over there and so on, and they have clearer clarity of mind, so if the brain is non-functional, where do you suppose the near-death experience is happening?
And what did he say?
He said, well, he thought for a while, and he said, he cited Aldous Huxley's idea that the brain is a reducing valve, and we're originally omniscient, and that certain experiences can remove the restricting effects of the reducing valve, which, the reducing valve is here so that we can function in a three-dimensional world without without being overwhelmed by everything.
Right.
So, and then I asked him about psychedelics, and he's tried them, and he said that taking psychedelics allowed him to experience the things that he had not read about, that he had read about. And because he had experienced these things from psychedelics, he knew that they were true. And he could see what was basic in all the religions. You know Houston, don't you?
Yeah, and that's one of the wonderful things about Houston is he has been a serious practitioner, maybe over a 10-year period, of a number of the major religious traditions. Right. And early in his career, he had this breakthrough experience where he was already a very well-known national scholar, was a professor at MIT. And then he had this experience on the living room floor of Tim Leary's apartment. Right. And as he said, he discovered that everything that he had been teaching about was actually so. And that's the shift from an academician to maybe a practical mystic. And he's remained that way for decades now.
Yeah. I think there's this undercurrent in maybe academic circles, though, that mystical experience brought on by meditation, or maybe fasting, or austerities, or I don't know what else. It takes precedence over experiences which are brought on, induced by psychedelics.
Yeah, and I kind of love that argument, because at least we now are talking about that mystical experiences are something which we achieve by using our own bodies and our own biochemistry. And if you begin to study the meditative literature, there's a lot of biochemistry about what happens when you're doing meditation. And when you study the psychedelic literature, there's also a lot of biochemistry. And the notion that the divine has to meet the criteria of academics seems a little childlike. Right. And there was a wonderful article years and years ago where a Quaker made that argument. And then in the middle of his essay, he says, of course, it may be that God actually knows more even than Quakers. And so that's kind of where I come down on it, which is if it looks like a mystical experience, and if it walks like a mystical experience, and it has the effects on one's life as a mystical experience, then it's probably a mystical experience.
Right. Yeah. I read a lot about people who claim to have had mystical experience as a result of taking psychedelics. And there are studies on this sort of thing. But has there been much research on people who just have spontaneous mystical experiences?
Oh, yeah. And
where do you find these people?
Well, they usually come up and talk to you, or they set up little groups, or they have a divine experience. Allah is one of them. Muhammad is one of them, right? Where an angel spoke to him and asked him to write things down. we consider that a spontaneous mystical experience, except the word spontaneous suggests that he had no preparation, and that's not true at all. So if we look at the saints of history who've had mystical experiences, they have been working in that area. They care. And of course, I like the Quakers, some things happen that we don't understand.
Yeah, yeah.
The nice thing is that working with psychedelics, one can begin to study that question, which is, what is a mystical experience? How can it be produced? Is there something about your prior background? Is there something about your biochemistry? And we can actually now take science and blend it with mystical experience in a way that was really impossible before.
What is a mystical experience?
A mystical experience is the awareness that your own identity is linked to and connected to and part of a larger sphere of awareness, which may extend to a feeling of being at one with all other people. It may extend to being at one with, the Buddhist term, all sentient beings, all beings that think. It may be, as you get from ayahuasca and other South American psychedelics, the feeling of being part of the biology of the planet, that you and the plants and the animals and the fish and the bacteria all are this one living interconnected being, which, as we know from ecology, is simply true. And there's the mystical experience, which says you are actually one with not only the animate universe, but what we call the inanimate or the material universe as well. And that experience of being part of, not separate from, is what we would call the mystical experience.
Yeah. So people who have these experiences are true for them.
Exactly.
And they really don't need outside research, or they don't need to have their experience validated, although I can't help but think that they would like to know what it really is. I mean, is there life after death? I mean, you know, if many people who take psychedelics feel that they are dying and that they're being reborn, and I know that people who have near-death experiences are completely lose their fear of death,
Right.
and as a result lose their fear of living, and so they go out doing things that most people would never dream of doing. But is the near-death experience different from the psychedelic experience?
Well, I can only talk about one half of that equation.
Okay.
Which is the psychedelic experience is so varied, and there's so many kinds. It's a little bit like flavors of ice cream. Right. There's just a huge span of experiences, from trivial to pleasant to fun to confusing, difficult, disturbing, to happy, therapeutic, life-changing, and transcendental. That's kind of the continuum. And the almost death experience is much more on this end, much more on the transcendental end. It changes people's belief in a very fundamental way, as do these higher or spiritual psychedelic experiences. So they're similar in that way.
Yeah. What do you think it would take for a scientist to become convinced that consciousness continues after death?
Depends on the scientist. What I've found is scientists actually resemble real people in almost every way, except for some of their belief systems. And most of the scientists I work with basically say, I'm not sure what happens after death, but from my own personal inner experience, it is likely that something goes on. It is not necessarily true that Jim Fadiman goes on. And the image that makes sense is if you look at the ocean and make that kind of all life, and then you pull a drop out of it, which is made up of ocean, but it's a very separate drop, and it has an identity. This is drop number 208. And let's say that's the Jim Fadiman drop. And it goes through its life cycle, and then eventually the physical part decomposes, and the form, that dropness, returns to the ocean. Now, does it return to the ocean and stay as a drop, or does it return to the ocean and kind of spread out? I'll let you know, hopefully in a long time.
Okay. Okay, I don't know where exactly to go with this, but Sam Parnia, is a doctor on the East Coast, is doing a study with several hospitals, and they're putting numbers, I think, or codes, or
Something on the ceiling?
words near the ceiling. And if it's true that people actually have an out-of-body experience and rise toward the ceiling and see what's going on back here, that will be proof. If they can remember the number and tell the doctor, that'll be proof that that consciousness may be independent of the brain, because the brain is down there and you're seeing up there.
One shouldn't confuse what would be an obvious proof, in a logical sense, and what people are willing to accept. Let me just give you an example. Ready?
Okay.
Climate change. Okay?
All right.
There's millions of people, only in the United States, by the way, it's the only country in the world where this issue is debated, feel there is no climate change, or that it is not caused by human beings.
Right.
Now, thousands of scientists are on one side, and many, many people are on the other. No, more science isn't going to make any difference.
Right.
So this lovely experiment will prove to those of us who are open to that kind of data that some people have out-of-the-body experiences. And then we're still in this body and we still have to function. So I'm not sure it's going to change anyone's life.
Are
very
you
much.
saying that answers to ultimate questions are just out of our reach?
Well, that's why we call them ultimate questions. As soon as we answer them, they're not ultimate. It's like, what's the structure of the atom? And the answer used to be, was a wonderful system. And we had electrons and protons and neutrons, and it was really clean. Everything was answered.
Yeah.
And then people found out, well, everything was answered, but none of it was very true. And now we have like 31 particles, 31 different kinds of particles inside the atom,
Right.
and we're looking for a couple to prove another theory. So ultimate questions lead to better ultimate questions.
Right, right. I asked Pim van Lommel, the cardiologist who did, up to that time, the world's largest study on cardiac arrest patients who've been resuscitated, and asked one question: do you have a memory of your period of unconsciousness?
Right.
When you were flatlined? And about 18% said yes, and 12% had a core near-death experience. So I asked Dr. van Lommel, how is it that people can see what's going on if they have flatline? And he said, well, they really don't see as you might imagine. They perceive, and they don't hear exactly as you think people would hear. Their communication is done telepathically. That's an off-putting word, but it's known without anything.
They have access to
intermediary.
information, and they don't have senses to do it with.
Yes.
Right. And we have that all the time.
Tell me.
Well, you enter a room, and across the room, you connect with someone.
Right.
You've never met them, but you both know something has happened. And gradually during the evening...
And you both know that the other person, something has happened to the other person. Yeah.
And then at some point you get together and you say something like, I don't know what's going on, but I find you very interesting or attractive.
Right.
And the other says, I find you the same way. And then you start to figure out what to do with that. So I don't think this is such an uncommon thing. The idea that we only have 5 senses doesn't make much sense, because obviously we dream and we have all kinds of interesting things in dream. What are we dreaming with? When we hear something in a dream, do you think our ear is hearing something? That's nonsense. No. So we're actually used to having interesting information without senses. Right. So the fact that you can do it on a hospital table, fine.
Okay. Dr. Fadiman, you have written this book, The Psychedelic Explorer's Guide, and it's Safe, Therapeutic, and Sacred Journeys. So let's maybe somewhat leave the spiritual for a moment.
Yes.
And you have become fascinated by people who take LSD on very small doses, microdoses.
Yes.
What are they called, tenors?
Well, some of them are called tenors, meaning 10 micrograms, which is below what's called a subperceptual threshold, which means you have no perceptual awareness that you've taken something. What one of the people said is the rocks don't glow even a little.
Right.
But at that dose, what happens to people, and I've been getting reports from all over the country, people who are taking it, say, once every 3 days, this little teeny dose, and what they report is the day goes better. It's as if someone again called it an all chakra enhancer, meaning the various energy parts of the body seem to work a little better. So people report that they can focus for a little longer, that they eat a little more carefully, that they do maybe one more set of reps at the gym, that they're a little kinder to that person in their office who they usually don't like. And at the end of the day, their report is, I had a really wonderful day. And when we go back into the history of psychedelics, we go back to the chemist who first discovered it, Albert Hofmann. He talked about that. And he said it's a very under-researched area. And
Really?
so
I didn't know that.
that he was interested in that very low dose as a kind of health, basically to make one healthier.
And he
make
lived
one
to be how
function.
long?
He only lived to be 102. But at 101, he was still giving 2-hour lectures.
Right.
So he's a good role model for any of us, and one certainly wants to find out what helped him, and this may have been one of the things that was helpful.
Right. Now, this isn't really in the realm of research, is it?
Not yet.
Okay, so how do you know about these people?
Well, 23 million people have taken LSD in this country in
Right.
every conceivable way you can imagine.
Right.
And there are websites of thousands of reports of various psychedelics. One called Arrowid, A-U-R,
Right.
which is probably the best resource for anything you can imagine in this area.
Yeah. EROWID. Yeah.
And you then find out when you start asking questions. So I now know of people who have used a microdose of psilocybin, which is the mushroom, to help them drive across country without getting bored.
Really?
I know someone else who is a model, an artist model, who indicated that it's easier to hold poses for the art students for longer with, again, these little microdoses. I know someone else who is using a different substance to help him read medieval Hebrew manuscripts. Okay? So it's an area that we don't know much.
Right.
But we're learning, and when I say people tend to have a good day, that's a generalization. And of course, for some people, they say, I tried this, I don't like it at all, and they stop. So far in the data I've collected, and this is generally just people sending it to me, there's been no serious negative concerns. There have been people for whom it's not their cup of tea is not quite the right metaphor, but their teeny cup of tea, and they stop.
Yeah. Now, going up a bit, there are people who experience certain things by taking 100 micrograms. Is that right? Tell us about that.
Well, that's a fascinating area because this is scientists, and this was research that I was part of, and it was working with senior scientists, and they had to, in order to get into this study, which was on enhanced creativity, they had to have a problem that they had worked on for several months and had not been successful. So they were very motivated to solve the problem because they were smart, they were special, they knew a lot about the topic, and they had a personal stake in it because they had not succeeded.
Right. Is an intention
Right.
part of the result that you will eventually get? Is holding an intention in mind helpful in...
Well, it's particularly helpful when you're using a psychedelic because
Yeah.
when we started this research, the general belief, which we shared, was psychedelics would take your mind in all kinds of interesting places and you wouldn't necessarily want to focus on science.
Yeah.
So we thought, well, let's check.
Yeah.
And so we had people who were really wanted to solve a problem. That was their interest. And we gave them 100 micrograms in a safe, secure setting.
Sure.
And they took a few hours to just let their minds go and open. And then we said, okay, at the peak of the experience, we're going to ask you to sit up and work on your problems. And what we found in about 44 problems, and 20 of them were new directions in research. There were a number of just plain solutions. There were 4 out of the 44 where they said they made no progress.
Right.
And what they also said is for some months thereafter, they felt, totally subjective, that they were somewhat more creative. So what it looks like is the part of the mind that is filled with data and science is capable of more than it's used to doing.
Right. Right.
Kind of the way we have these wonderful pictures of the mother whose child, the car rolls slightly backwards and it's over their child, and this little 120-pound woman lifts the car up with one hand, takes the child out and puts the car down.
Right.
And then the National Enquirer shows up a few days later and says, could you do that again? We'd like to take a picture. And she says, are you crazy? I'm a 120-pound woman, and that's a huge car.
Right.
So we're capable of extraordinary things.
Yeah.
And if we're focused, that's the direction that our extraordinariness can take.
Yeah. As I remember, there are 2 Nobel Prize winners that attribute their research to LSD. One of them is Francis Crick, and
Yep.
he discovered on LSD, he saw the double helix of LSD, and the other one is Kary Mullis, and
Right.
he invented PCR.
Recombinant DNA.
Yeah, right.
What we see in all the criminal trials.
Yeah, but he said, I doubt very much if I could have come to this breakthrough if it had not been for LSD.
Now, there's a difference in the two. With Crick,
Yeah.
he was trying to visualize this thing called DNA, and he'd gotten as far as a single helix.
Right.
And with 100 micrograms, we think, we're not quite sure, because he only talked about it very briefly before his death, he saw the double helix.
Right.
And there is a curious thing, which is there's another substance called ayahuasca.
Exactly.
Comes out of Peru,
Yeah.
or out of many parts of South America, and that many, many, many people who take that substance see 2 intertwined snakes.
Jeremy Narby, the cosmic
In-
serpent, yeah.
In other words, they see something that looks an awful lot like a double helix. And there's an argument that Jeremy Narby makes that they are actually seeing the DNA and seeing it, kind of visualizing it as intertwined snakes. And we don't know, of course, but it's a lovely notion that here from 2 totally different parts of the kind of psychic universe, this particular form happens. Well, what you find out is it's, in a sense, you think, well, gee, I'm limited to the 5 senses. But it's not true at all. That with scientific instruments, you can see stars 100 billion years away. You can see individual molecules with some help.
Right.
And so here are these biochemical helps which allow you to see that the way you thought reality was is a limited case. It isn't that it is that, and it's that, and it's that, and it's that, and then your worldview simply shifts. And there's a wonderful World War I song which says, how are you going to keep them down on the farm after they've seen Paris? Right? Which is, how do you take someone from a little teeny town in Minnesota, have them spend years in Europe, in terms of Paris and Munich and Rome, and then if they come back to the farm, their worldview has changed. They can't think that the world is tiny anymore.
Okay.
And that seems to be what people are talking about.
Okay. So let's go beyond Paris for a while and go up to, 200 micrograms of LSD? What happens when we do that?
In the range of 200, we're talking the psychotherapeutic range. And these are where people can really see their own psychodynamics without being upset by it.
Right. Question. I've heard that one session with a psychedelic with proper preparation, set and
Safe
setting,
and
a
safe.
guide, and so on, like you talk about so eloquently in your book, one session can be the equivalent of maybe years of psychotherapy.
Well, that's a little bit taking it from the psychotherapist's point of view, where he says it would take me this long to help
He has
this
to
patient.
make a living.
Exactly. I find it a little wiser to say, because it's nice when you have a psychotherapist and then someone has a psychedelic experience and the psychotherapist says, wow, we can now work much more easily because you're not frightened by the things that were going wrong in your life. We can look at them without you getting so defensive, because you say to yourself, oh, well, that's just the way I was before I understood myself better. So when you understand yourself better, you may be just as neurotic, but you don't let it bother you the same way. Okay? And it's one of the great joys of those of us who've worked with Ram Dass over many years, is he has lots of neurotic stuff, and he's a highly enlightened being.
And he's a nice guy.
Right, which is when you become enlightened, people talk about ego death, and I always think that's nonsense, because I say, how about arm death? If you're enlightened, your arms fall off. They say, no, my arms stay. Well, your ego stays, but it doesn't get in the way the same way. And that's extraordinary.
Dr. Fadiman, we've got 2 minutes left, but the next step up is 400.
Yes, 400 is what's called an entheogenic, or a deity manifesting. That's where you have a classical mystical experience of total oneness, of total awareness of personal immortality, of connection with all beings, what the Buddhists call the 10,000 worlds. And it is a paradigm changer that's much deeper than psychotherapy. It's much more powerful, and people who have it, about 9 out of 10 say it is the single most important experience of their entire lives.
Right. Okay, we've got about a minute left, and I would like to be true to your book here, The Psychedelic Explorer's Guide. 23 million people have tried LSD in the United States.
Right.
Your point in writing this book is because since they're going to try it anyway, you want to make sure they have a safe experience.
Absolutely.
So can you give us just some brief advice in the minute that we've got left? How can you do it safely?
Have a guide who knows more than you do. Have only people you feel good about. Have it in a situation where you feel safe and secure, not to be disturbed. Turn off your cell phone.
Right.
Use music, which has been historically with all the shamanistic work the same. And keep in mind these substances are still illegal, and one must be conscious and careful and considerate when one is thinking of doing anything with these substances.
What do you think is the future of these substances? Are they going to become legal soon? If you were president, what would you like to see happen concerning these substances?
Well, after I stop the wars and get all that money back and hire people and make the roads, I would like people to have religious freedom, to get close to divinity if they are able to do so in a safe setting. I'd like people to be able to explore themselves in a safe, secure setting. I think that's a human right. And I think science must be allowed to explore everything, and that's a basic human right. So I'd simply restore basic human rights for self, science, and theology.
Okay. Dr. Fadiman, our time is up. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you.
Yeah. The book is The Psychedelic Explorer's Guide. If you're one of these people who is going to do it anyway, read the book. You'll find out how. We're not encouraging it. We're just informing you how to be safe. So thank you for watching. And Dr. Fadiman, thank you.
It's a pleasure.
Yeah. Okay.